To think you know the Middle Ages, the age of knights, kings, castles, and the iron grip of the church? Well, buckle up, because the truth about sexuality in the medieval world is darker, stranger, and far more shocking than the sanitized stories in history textbooks. Behind the stone walls of monasteries and royal courts, desire refused to die. A time when same-sex love was carved into tomb walls and whispered about in sacred halls. A world where the church thundered against unnatural sin in sermons, yet its own priests and nobles wrote letters and poems dripping with forbidden passion. And if you think this is unbelievable, wait until you see what lies ahead. Subscribe now, because the next secrets we uncover are the ones history tried hardest to erase. This was an age of contradictions, where knights pledged their hearts to fellow warriors more fiercely than to their wives, where queens' maidens forged secret bonds in shadowed chambers, where trials for sodomy filled the records, yet hidden romances endured in silence. And all the while, power dictated morality, acts of love between equals punished with fire, while kings and lords could bend the rules in the name of dominance. You're about to uncover the shocking truths that make the Middle Ages look less like a holy age of purity and more like a battleground of desire, repression, and survival. From the tombs of ancient lovers to the cruel punishments meted out by church courts, from the whispered romances of monarchs to the myths twisted into weapons of shame, this is the story that will change everything you thought you knew about the medieval world. Picture this. You're not standing in a brightly lit museum staring at relics behind glass. You are deep beneath the sands of the Saqqara necropolis, a city of the dead, where the air is heavy with the dust of centuries. The silence is broken only by the soft scrape of your steps against the stone floor. Before you lies a tomb that was sealed for more than 4,000 years, hidden until the 20th century. It does not belong to a pharaoh or a warrior, but to two men, Kum-Hotep and Nyankum, manicurists of the royal court. In ancient Egypt, this was not a trivial role. To handle the king's hands with sharp tools was an office of immense trust, placing them closer to power than most courtiers could ever dream. As your eyes adjust to the flicker of torchlight, the walls begin to reveal themselves. They are alive with color, every inch meticulously painted to tell the story of the two men. You see them overseeing estates, directing workers, hunting in the marshes, presiding over banquets. The scenes are grand, filled with signs of wealth, respect, and prominence. Yet in the midst of these familiar depictions, something stands out. Something that makes your heart skip. There they are, standing face to face, nose to nose. Their arms curl around each other's backs, their bodies pressed in the same intimate gesture almost always reserved for husband and wife. It is the most sacred pose in Egyptian art, a visual declaration of affection. Around them, their wives and children appear, but as if deliberately minimized. They are smaller, peripheral, almost like background characters in a story whose true center is the bond between the two men. And in the most sacred chamber, the place of final offerings, Nyankum is depicted where a wife would normally be, embraced tenderly by Kum-Hotep. Nothing here is accidental. Every line, every placement is deliberate, a love story carved in stone for eternity. For centuries, Egyptologists struggled with the puzzle of the two men buried at Saqqara. At first, the explanation seemed simple, even convenient. The official narrative claimed they were brothers, perhaps even twins. This theory had the comfort of familiarity. Brothers could live together, work together, and even share a tomb. Their names both echoed the creator god Khnum, suggesting a familial link. To the conservative scholars of the 20th century, it was an acceptable answer, clean, respectable, and most importantly, non-threatening. But the problem was that the walls themselves refused to agree. In Egyptian art, nothing was random. Every pose, every gesture, every arrangement carried a precise meaning. Husbands and wives were shown standing close, embracing or touching noses, a gesture of intimacy so sacred it was reserved for lovers alone. Brothers, on the other hand, were depicted differently. They could be seated side by side, shown hunting or feasting together, or placed in scenes of shared responsibility, but they were never shown nose to nose, never locked in the embrace of marital affection. To use that imagery for siblings would have been jarring, even sacrilegious, a violation of the symbolic language that Egyptians guarded with devotion. And yet here, in the tomb of Kumhotep and Nyankum, the imagery is clear and repeated. These men were portrayed as if they were husband and wife. To dismiss this as mere brotherly affection is to ignore the deliberate choices made by the artists and the men themselves. But then a complication arises. Both men had wives and children. Their images appear on the walls too, smaller but present, their existence impossible to deny. Does this contradict the idea of a same-sex bond, or does it deepen it? To understand, we must enter the worldview of ancient Egypt. Society was built upon Maat, the divine order, the principle that balanced the universe. Every person was bound to uphold this harmony, and for men, one of the most sacred duties was procreation. To marry, to father children, to continue the family line. These were not private choices, but cosmic responsibilities. Without children, a man risked obliteration in the afterlife. No one would perform rituals at his tomb, no one would call his name, and his spirit would wither in silence. For high-ranking officials like Kumhotep and Nyankum, failing in this duty would have been unthinkable. So they married. They fathered children, they upheld their duty to Maat and satisfied society's expectations. On paper, their lives looked perfectly conventional. But the tomb tells a different story. Look closely, and you see the subtle hierarchy carved in stone. The wives and children are there, acknowledged but peripheral, pushed to the margins. Smaller in scale, they orbit the men rather than stand beside them. In every major scene, the banquets, the estates, the sacred offering, it is Kumhotep and Nyankum who occupy the central space. They are shown as a pair, equals, joined in work, in leisure, and in eternity. In the most sacred scene of all, where final offerings are presented, Nyankum appears where a wife would normally stand, embraced from behind by Kumhotep in a gesture of tenderness and union. This was no accident. Egyptian tombs were not casual decorations. They were eternal scripts, religious documents designed to guide the deceased into the afterlife. Every image had meaning, and every placement carried weight. To depict two men in this way was a bold statement. It was not hidden. It was not ambiguous. It was carved in stone for eternity. The wives, the children, the duties, they are there to satisfy the demands of society and the gods. But the art whispers a deeper truth. The heart of this tomb, the eternal partnership at its center, belonged not to husband and wife, but to two men who chose to be remembered together as one. When we move beyond the painted walls of Saqqara and step into the wider body of Egyptian records, something striking emerges. Not what is present, but what is absent. Across more than 3,000 years of dynastic history, through libraries of legal codes, wisdom texts, moral instructions, and ritual prescriptions, there is not a single law prohibiting sexual relations between people of the same gender. Egypt, a civilization obsessed with rules, with order, with balance, had regulations for nearly everything. They dictated how one divided property, how to calculate taxes, how to bury the dead, how to perform rituals. There were laws against blasphemy, laws against theft, laws against adultery, laws against disturbing sacred animals, and yet, in this sprawling system, silence reigns on the subject of homosexuality. This silence does not prove acceptance, but it powerfully undermines the idea of criminalization. A society legislates against what it fears, against what it considers a threat to cosmic order. The Egyptians feared grave robbers, tax cheats, and those who might disrupt the sacred cycles of the Nile. They did not, it seems, fear two men or two women loving each other. This absence becomes even more intriguing when we look at morality. The Egyptians left behind one of the most detailed moral checklists in human history, the negative confession, recited by the dead before Osiris in the Hall of Judgment. I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not defiled the sacred waters, I have not committed adultery. The list is long, exhaustive, covering sins both great and small, down to mistreating servants or failing to honor one's parents. But never, not once, does it say, I have not lain with a man. It is absent. For the Egyptians, what mattered was not the gender of the participants, but the consequences of the act. Sex with another man's wife was a sin because it disrupted his household and his lineage. Sex in a sacred temple was a sin because it violated holy ground. But a consensual act between two men, the records do not condemn it, do not even acknowledge it. It simply was not considered a violation of Ma'at, and yet silence is not the same as celebration. To understand how the Egyptians may have viewed such relationships, we must turn to their myths. Myths were more than stories. They were moral maps, teaching tools that explained what society valued and what it feared. One of the most telling myths is the story of Horus and Set, a tale of rivalry, betrayal, and divine justice. After Osiris was murdered, his son Horus and his brother Set fought for the throne of Egypt. Their struggle was fierce and unending, symbolizing the eternal battle between order and chaos. And within this myth, sexuality became a weapon. According to one famous episode, Set invited Horus to his home, pretending to seek peace. But under the cover of night, he forced himself upon him. This was no act of passion. It was domination, a calculated attempt to humiliate Horus and prove his unworthiness to rule. In the ancient worldview, to be penetrated was to be symbolically feminized, to be cast into a submissive role. For Set, this was the ultimate insult, a way to strip Horus of his masculinity and authority. The next day, he boasted before the tribunal of the gods, I have done the work of a man upon Horus. But Horus and his mother Isis turned the tables. Horus had secretly captured Set's semen and discarded it, while planting his own seed upon lettuce leaves, Set's favorite food. When the gods summoned proof, Set's seed answered from the river, while Horus's answered from inside Set himself. The gods laughed, and Set's claim collapsed in humiliation. For centuries, scholars interpreted this myth as evidence that the Egyptians condemned homosexuality. But look closely. The problem here is not that Set lay with another man. The problem is that he did so without consent, as an act of violence and humiliation. The shame is not in the act itself, but in being forced into submission. The active partner retained his masculinity. The passive one risked losing it. The myth was not about love. It was about power. This distinction changes everything. It suggests that what troubled the Egyptians was not same-sex intimacy in itself, but its place within the rigid hierarchy of dominance and submission. To be active was to remain manly, authoritative. To be passive was to risk being seen as feminine, weaker, a disruption to social order. This mirrors the attitudes of other ancient civilizations, particularly Rome, where freeborn men could take male lovers as long as those lovers were slaves, prostitutes, or of lower status. The defining line was not gender, but power. And so the myth of Horus and Set reveals a world where sexuality was understood through hierarchy, not orientation. It explains why a king like Neferkara could be described as spending nights with his general without scandal. The king, by definition, was dominant. His actions were above reproach. What it does not explain is the tomb of Kumhotep and Nyankum, where two men of equal status are shown in a pose of mutual affection, not dominance and submission. Their tomb does not fit the pattern. It stands as a quiet contradiction to the logic of the myth, a love between equals immortalized in paint and stone. Stone. So too must we learn to read between the lines, to imagine the unrecorded lives of women whose loves left no mark but must have existed, as constant and real as the desert wind. But if the tomb of Kumhotep and Nyankum spoke so boldly, if it whispered its truth through painted walls for eternity, why has it taken us so long to hear it? The answer lies not in Egypt alone, but in what happened to Egypt after its golden age. No civilization exists in isolation. The sands of the Nile became the prize of conquerors, and with each conquest came new gods, new laws, and new moralities. The first great shift arrived with the Greeks. When Alexander the Great stormed into Egypt in 332 BC, he did not simply seize territory, he imported a culture with its own complicated attitudes towards same-sex love. The Spartans had woven it into military life. The Athenians had written philosophical treatises debating its morality and its role in education. The Greeks codified what the Egyptians had left ambiguous. Love between men was not erased, but reframed within categories, labeled, dissected, debated. And then came Rome. When Rome annexed Egypt in 30 BC, it brought with it an even sharper obsession with dominance and submission. For the Romans, masculinity was defined by the active role. To be passive was shameful, effeminate, unworthy of a free-born man. This mindset settled over Egypt like a heavy cloak, pressing its hierarchies onto a culture that had once been more fluid. Yet the deepest rupture was still to come. With the spread of Christianity, the ancient silence of Egyptian law gave way to a new language: sin. No longer was morality measured by whether an act disrupted Maat or threatened order. Now it was measured against divine command. Paul's words in the New Testament echoed across the empire. Men inflamed with lust for one another, committing shameful acts. For the first time, same-sex intimacy was not just socially suspect, it was spiritually condemned. The embrace of Kumhotep and Nyankum, once perhaps a tender celebration of life shared, was reimagined as evidence of depravity. Where their society had allowed silence, Christianity imposed judgment. And when Islam arrived in the 7th century, the condemnation hardened into law. Under Sharia, homosexual acts were explicitly prohibited, punishable by severe penalties. In a land once defined by Maat's balance, the idea of fluid arrangements and dual lives vanished beneath the weight of scriptural prohibitions. Centuries later, when European archaeologists rediscovered Egypt, they brought their own baggage. The tomb of Kumhotep and Nyankum was opened in 1964, but the men who studied it were Victorians in spirit, shaped by a society that criminalized homosexuality at home. For them to suggest that two men in ancient Egypt had been lovers was not simply controversial, it was unthinkable. They clung to the safer explanation, the two brothers. It was easier, more respectable, more aligned with their own prejudices. And so the love story was buried again, not under sand this time, but under scholarship. Only recently, as our world has changed, has the story begun to surface once more. As LGBTQ+ communities have fought for visibility, dignity, and history, scholars have dared to look again with fresh eyes. The embrace that once seemed so easily dismissed now glows with new meaning. The wives and children, once seen as proof against a romantic interpretation, are now understood as part of a more complex arrangement, societal duty fulfilled alongside personal truth. Slowly, the silence is lifting. And this is where the story matters most, not in the dusty recesses of history, but in the mirror it holds up to us today. Kumhotep and Nyankum's tomb is not just a relic of the past, it is a challenge to the present. It asks, how do we choose which stories to tell? Whose love do we record and whose do we erase? For 2,000 years, the answer has been shaped by prejudice, by conquerors, by religion, by fear. But the walls of their tomb remind us that history is never fixed. The paintings have not changed, only our eyes have. Their story forces us to reconsider the arrogance of modernity. We often think of ourselves as more enlightened than the ancients, as if tolerance and complexity belong to us alone. But perhaps, in some ways, the ancients were more flexible, more pragmatic. They may not have had a word for homosexual, but they carved into stone the truth of two men who loved and lived together. Their society, rigid as it was, found space, small but real, for such a bond to exist. That is not ignorance. That is a kind of wisdom. And so we stand, thousands of years later, in the painted chamber of two royal manicurists, listening for their whispers. We see their embrace, their shared banquets, their partnership immortalized, and we realize that their message is not only about them, but about us. Love will always find a way, even in the narrowest cracks of society. It will carve itself into stone if it has to. The tragedy is not that Kum-Hotep and Nyang-Kum loved each other, but that we, centuries of us, refused to see it. Now, at last, we can.